Good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural Kaylin Romanescu lecture, which will be given this evening by Professor Emily Laidlaw, the inaugural holder of this position. I'm Kristen Boone, and I'm the Dean of the Common Law section at the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded, and we honor their knowledge keepers, both young and old, and their greatest leaders, past, present, and future. I am so pleased to see so many of you gathered here this evening to engage in a conversation of freedom of expression in the digital age. Freedom of expression is at the heart of our academic culture, and tonight's lecture will remind us that it is a right that carries both duties and responsibilities. In an era where online voices are amplified as well as harms, our understanding of free expression is evolving to account power, accountability, and the collective impact of our words. La section de common law est depuis longtemps un lieu privilégié de réflexion critique et de débat civique à la croisée du droit, de la technologie et du droit de la personne. Nous devons continuer à poser des questions difficiles, mais essentielles, sur la manière dont le droit peut protéger à la fois la liberté et la dignité dans un monde toujours plus numérique. La professeure invitée, Romanescu, pour la lutte contre les discours haineux, a récemment créé, grâce à la générosité et la vision de M. Kaylin Romanescu, joue un rôle essentiel dans l'avancement de la mission de notre faculté. In addition to delivering this public lecture, Professor Laidlaw is responsible for teaching a course on hate speech, which explores its manifestations through anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of discrimination, as well as contributing to the research, training, and open discourse here at the Common Law section in this critical field. I was absolutely thrilled when Professor Laidlaw accepted this honor this past summer, and I'm equally eager to hear her speak today. She comes with an incredible background, bringing a national perspective as she's a professor of law at the University of Calgary. I hear from the students that her course is engaging, rigorous, and exciting. And I think that she is really contributing to an important service, an important dialogue that we are fostering here at the Faculty of Law. J'aimerais aussi exprimer ma profonde gratitude à professeur Florian Martin Barito et à son équipe du Centre de recherche en droit, technologie et société pour l'organisation de cet événement. Comme plusieurs d'entre vous le savent, le CDTS est le principal groupe de recherche canadien en droit éthique et politique dans la technologie, ainsi que chef de file mondial dans l'avancement de la recherche dans ce domaine. After the lecture, a panel discussion with Professors Emily Laidlaw, Jane Bailey, Michael Geist, and Florian Martin Barito will follow, and we'll be a period for question in just to let people in the room know, a number of classes just let out at 5:30, so we're expecting more people to enter the room in the coming minutes, and we're looking forward to an exciting conversation this evening. We are very honored that Kaylin Romanescu, former Chancellor of the University of Ottawa, has funded this professorship on anti-hate speech. He is here with us this evening. I'm going to shortly pass the floor to him so he can say some opening remarks. I would just like to give you a bit of a background on who he is and why this is so important to our faculty. Mr. Romanescu is a graduate of the Common Law section. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Ottawa in 2014, and he served as the Chancellor of the University of Ottawa from 2015 to 2022. In 2023, he was appointed the honorary chair of the U Ottawa Reimagine fundraising campaign. I've had the great privilege of getting to know Mr. Romanescu over the last few years as dean. He is rigorous, thoughtful, and deeply committed to free speech in our society. I think it's incredibly exciting that he comes back to us as a graduate and a former chancellor to sponsor this initiative tonight. He has had a distinguished 20-year career in corporate law in Canada and the United Kingdom before becoming a leader in the broader business world as the CEO and president of Air Canada. the country's largest airline, until his retirement in 2021. He has numerous recognitions of his business leadership and his philanthropy, and we are incredibly grateful for his continuing involvement in faculty of law. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Calin Gillespie.
Thank you very much, Dean Boone. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. First of all, before I do anything else, I need to welcome and recognize my good friend, the Honorable Justice Nicholas Kazir of the Supreme Court of Canada. We worked together at Stikeman Elliott many years ago, and it's a distinct honor that Justice Kazir that you have come with us this evening. I also want to recognize Alan Kessel, who's a very senior person for many years in the Foreign Affairs Department, diplomat, and played an important role in the United Kingdom, Deputy High Commissioner, and now with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, an extremely important work that you do. Thank you for coming out this evening as well. And my other good friend, Jacques Shore, a senior partner of Gowlings, which I think this room bears the name, if I'm not mistaken. So here to honor the room that your firm has sponsored. Thank you, Jacques, for coming as well. Donc, bonjour à tous et merci d'être avec nous ce soir. Lorsque mon épouse, Elaine et moi avons décidé de créer cette chaire de professeurs invités à l'Université d'Ottawa, nous sentions qu'il fallait faire quelque chose de concret pour aider à combattre la montée de la haine débridée dont nous étions témoins. We felt we needed to do something concrete to help in starting to turn the tide on this unbridled hate we were witnessing, both online and in the real world. And I think U Ottawa is the first university tackling this. This issue is as urgent as it is complex. Online venom, anti-Semitism, dangerous rhetoric, often inciting others towards civil disobedience and violence in digital spaces and well into the real world, including, of course, at universities. These are not abstract problems. They are forces that shape toxic beliefs, fuel division, and in some cases, precipitate real-world violence. For many of us, the internet is where we learn, debate, and connect. But it is also where harmful ideas travel faster and farther than ever before. Words that once might have remained on the margins now reach millions with a single click. And misinformation, scapegoating, and dehumanization, especially toward Jewish communities, racial minorities, outspoken advocates with a different point of view, like Charlie Kirk and others, can be amplified through algorithms designed not for truth or safety, but for engagement. Part of the challenge lies in our relationship with social media itself. These platforms are engineered to hold our attention. They reward outrage and whatever else keeps us scrolling. In that environment, hateful content doesn't just appear, it thrives. It can become addictive, drawing people into cycles of anger and confirmation bias, slowly shifting norms and making once unthinkable rhetoric feel commonplace. And history has shown us repeatedly that when harmful speech becomes normalized, violence is never far behind. That is why understanding, identifying, and countering online hate isn't simply a matter of digital literacy or good hygiene. It's a matter of public safety, community resilience, and moral responsibility. As you heard, I served as Chancellor of the University of Ottawa for 7 years, and I know that universities in particular have a role to play as spaces where young people are supposed to learn how to think critically, how to develop their worldview, where dialogue should be honest but respectful, where we should be able to debate someone by looking each other in the eye, without masks or face coverings, and without the armor of a keyboard or a fake social media account, where we can model how to challenge harmful narratives without resorting to them ourselves. As a society, besides advocating for freedom of expression, which is highly important, we need to vehemently advocate for core values of decency, freedom, freedom of religion, and freedom to live, work, study, and raise a family in a peaceful and safe environment. So it is my hope that through Professor Emily Laidlaw's course, our students will better learn how hate spreads, why it spreads, and more importantly, what we can do as students, educators, citizens to interrupt that process. Because combating hate is not about restricting ideas or free debate. It's about protecting people and ensuring their dignity and safety, which in our Canadian society is, as far as I'm concerned, not negotiable. So with that, I think someone else will formally introduce Professor Laidlaw, but I'm honored to have you as the inaugural Romanescu professor. I'm honored to attach my name to your distinguished career as a professor and look forward to this evening's lecture. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, j'ai le plaisir de présenter formellement ce soir la professeure Laidlaw. My colleague, my collaborator, and my friend, Dr. Emily Laidlaw, who is so tonight I'm in this room, she's the Romanescu Visiting Scholar on anti-hate speech and an associate member of the Center for Law, Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa. And she's also, when she's not in Ottawa, the Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law and Associate Professor of Law at the University of Calgary. Quand on parle au sujet de la liberté d'expression en ligne, des préjudices en ligne, et qu'on se pose ce genre de questions, généralement, les organismes de la société civile, les décideurs publics, le grand public se tournent vers Emily Laidlaw. She has been at the forefront of this conversation and those policy conversation in Canada for many years as a scholar, but also as an influencer in the public policy in Canada. She was the co-chair of the Government of Canada expert panel on online harm that led to what was for a short period of time Bill C-63, but I'm sure she will talk about during her talk. And Mr. Romanescu was mentioning calling this a public safety issue. It's a cybersecurity issue, and with Emily, we had the pleasure of sitting on the Council of Canadian Academies expert panel on digital public safety, where we advocated a lot for those kind of issues to be included within cybersecurity policy and narratives. And last Thursday, we hit the final approval button to send our latest edited collection, The Security of Self, to the printer, in which we, with a group of scholars, including Jane Berlin tonight in the room, we invite you redefining the concept of cybersecurity. So tonight for our event, we will start with a keynote by Professor Laidlaw. And then, as Jinbun explained, she will be joined by two other colleagues from the law school, Professor Michael Geis and Professor Jane Berlin for a conversation. And you also all invited to contribute to this conversation. We have a full house tonight, and I know it's a topic that a lot of people have opinions and questions about. So to ease this conversation, we have thought of doing more an online polling and questions. So even during Professor Laidlaw keynote, you can start to ask your question and share your comments. You can scan the QR code that is on the screen to start the conversation online, and then when the co-panelists will join us, we will feed those questions in the conversation. So hopefully we can address all of your questions and concerns. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Emily, for your keynote. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm introductions. In particular, thank you to the Faculty of Law, to the Center for Technology, Law, and Society for for hosting this evening and me throughout the semester. And a special thank you to Caitlin Romanescu. It was your generous support that has made this fellowship possible. And I have had the joy to work with the University of Ottawa students, brilliant students this whole semester. And if you ever fear for the future, do not. We have an incredible group of leaders in training. So today, I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I have my phone next to me because no one needs me talking about this for 2 hours straight, so I will keep myself on track. I will talk about what freedom of expression asks of us. And I chose this title because so much of the focus of the public discourse on freedom of expression is on freedom. Freedom from censorship, freedom from state interference. These are crucial components about how we understand freedom of expression. We should be able to, for the most part, speak freely without fear of sanction. The problem is the tendency in public discourse to scale this to freedom writ large. This creates a misleading picture of what the right to freedom of expression is about. Freedom of expression is unique because by exercising the right, we can harm others. And the law says that sometimes that is okay. And this creates a dilemma. It creates a dilemma in law because we're constantly drawing lines about what is acceptable and unacceptable harm. And the burden of this system ends up being borne by those who are harmed by it. So freedom of expression asks a lot of us in, I would say, multiple ways, but two I'll mention here. First, it asks us to protect offensive, disturbing, and shocking expression based on just the idea that society as a whole benefits. And second, and I think this is what we've forgotten about freedoms, it is that it is the only right in international human rights that comes with duties and responsibilities. It recognizes that freedom of expression is power, and we should take great care with that power to exercise it responsibly. So I'm going to start with a story. And I had to, I mean, it was unfortunate how many I had to choose from, but I settled on this one. And it is what happened in the summer of 2024 in the United Kingdom in Southport. So 3 girls were killed during a Taylor Swift themed dance and yoga class. Now, the only information that was publicly released at the time was that the perpetrator was 17. So the perpetrator was Axel Rudakubana. He was born and raised in England. His parents were Rwandan. They fled in the 1990s seeking asylum in the UK. But what spread online was something else. What was spread was anti-immigrant and Islamophobic comments, that he immigrated by boat in 2023, that he was Muslim, that he was a foreigner. Within one day, millions of posts of this sort were made. And then this seeded to online influencers like Andrew Tate, who said, quote, undocumented migrant who arrived on a boat had attacked the girls in Southport. And he went on to say, the soul of the Western man is so broken that when the invaders slaughter your daughters, you do absolutely effing nothing. Other influencers with large followings made similar comments. One is a far-right campaigner, Tommy Robinson, and he said, they're replacing the British nation with hostile, violent, aggressive migrants. Your children don't matter to the Labour government. And of course, none of that was true. A British youth had committed an unspeakable crime. And as we all know, what happened next was this bubbled to the surface and riots broke out in Southport. But it seems that the original post that sparked all of this was a simple one on LinkedIn. And it's worth kind of reading it to you just for how casual and mundane some of the language is. My 2 youngest children went to the holiday club this morning in Southport for a day of fun, only for a migrant to enter and murder, fatally wound multiple children. My kids are fine. They're shocked and in hysterics, but they're safe. My thoughts are with the 30 other kids and family that are suffering right now. If there's any time to close the borders completely, it's right now. Enough is enough. His post was taken down within a few hours, but by that time it had been screenshot and shared to millions. And then this is what's seeded to the influencers. And this does follow a typical pattern. It's injection, amplify, and spread. A post, a mere speculation and rumors based on prejudicial assumptions, was picked up by these key influencers, exaggerated and amplified to a large audience, spread from there, sparked a riot. So where do we go? I want to dive a little bit deeper on the online ecosystem that we're working with right now. An easy framework, and this is something that I tend to work through with my students, is the ABCD framework. Now, this was set out for the mis and disinformation environment, so it doesn't translate entirely, although at its heart, all hate is based on false information spread to cause harm. But it's useful to understand what we're talking about online. So if we break it down, that A is for the actors. So this would be a focus on those that are actually spreading the false information and spreading the hate. B is for the behavioral techniques that are used. Increasingly, what's being used? AI to generate hate, whether it's deepfakes, whether it's just other AI-generated text or videos, bots, fake accounts, memes. We're going to talk about memes in a few minutes, different video snippets. These are the different behavioral techniques that are being used. And content is, of course, the actual hateful content that is posted online. Now, most regulations focus on the content level, but what we'll see as we go along is that increasingly we're seeing a shift to a focus on actors' behaviors, and the last one, the digital architecture of the spread of hate. Content is difficult to regulate, as we'll see, because these types of deceptive behaviors often fall into that category of what we often call lawful but awful information. Now, D is for the digital architecture. This would be the design of social media, the recommender systems, the paid advertising, the monetization of hate, and the different content moderation policies. So working with this structure, let's look for a moment at a content level. There are 4 characteristics that make messages resonate the most with users. It prompts an emotional response, it's visual, the narrative is strong, and repetition. Social media ticks every one of these boxes. In particular, memes tick these boxes. They are effective attack vectors, they are visual, they're emotive, they're short, they're funny. Importantly, they're also relatively ambiguous. They're used strategically often to pass or to share extremist content, because the tone is that it's just a joke. And so it's a way of creating belonging for those that are part of the meme and understand it, but it mocks outsiders for taking it too seriously. It's such a key strategy in information warfare that is often talked about as mimetic warfare. So what do we know? Prolonged exposure to this type of content normalizes hate, or extreme views. It essentially kind of shifts the Overton window. And it's hidden in plain sight, whether it's Pepe the Frog that I have up on the screen or the Yes Chad meme. They all seem innocuous, but it is a symbol of an ideology that only makes sense within the context of the extremist views of that particular community. So I just want to fuse out a few things here. I mentioned strategic ambiguity. That is the strategy of many extremist groups in sharing this type of content. And it's significantly difficult to deal with when it comes to regulation, because of the fact that it always falls in that lawful but awful category. It's hateful without being hate speech. It glorifies terrorism without counseling it. It's untruthful without being defamatory. But also, it's a whack-a-mole game. Consider the Buffalo attacker. He carried out a racially motivated attack at a grocery store and killed 10 Black Americans. By his own account, he was radicalized with white supremacist ideology starting on 4chan and 8chan and Reddit. He then live streamed his attack on Twitch. Twitch disabled access to the live stream within 2 minutes, but by that point, the clip had been shared widely across various platforms, and it remains in circulation to this day. He wrote a diary on Discord. He posted his manifesto to Google Docs. So this speaks to that cross-pollination challenge that we have in the social media space. So what are the design challenges, which we're going to talk about quite a bit? The underlying structure of hate is designed through the business models of social media and other platforms. So here are a few. One is often talked about as persuasive design. It's what adds that stickiness to the space that makes it almost addictive. It's why youth are particularly vulnerable when it comes to the use of social media. So there's the main approach to this is essentially choice architecture, where it's nudging users to make particular choices in those spaces. And the end goal is to keep them using the site. So gamification is a popular one where there's different rewards and credits when you engage in certain behavior online. Popularity metrics, I mean, how many here have felt good when someone likes your post and it makes you want to go back and it makes you want to post more. Anticipation mechanisms where you're sitting looking at the bubbles, waiting for another message. And I think one of the most impactful on youth right now is ephemeral content. They're afraid that if they step away from social media, they're going to miss out because that content disappears right away. I think the one I'm most prone to, as many, is infinite scrolling, which I did a lot of last night before going to bed instead of reading an excellent novel. So I am skipping ahead. There we go. Social media challenges. Let's keep going. The list is long. Kaylin mentioned the algorithms and the recommender systems. It pushes content to users that they think that they're going to like. And it tends to be pretty repetitive and boring. So if you end up down some rabbit hole, you get stuck there. And the system decides what content to promote or demote. And usually it's based on highly emotive factors. So famously, most people probably know is Facebook was rating angry and love emojis as 5 times more valuable than like emojis. Well, what happens? Then, or like rating, sorry, that pushes up the rage-filled content to the front of people's feeds. So the influence, the risk of hijacking minds, or to put it in charter terms, kind of interfering with our freedom of thought, is even more pronounced if we start pushing into the space of virtual reality and AI because of the immersiveness of those experiences. And the business model also creates challenges. Platforms have become central to all aspects of our society and economy. So Tim Wu has a book just coming out. He talks about it as the predatory extraction model. So of our data and our attention. So applying that here, hate becomes embedded in the business model. And hate is only addressed to the extent that it satisfies a cost-benefit analysis. Companies act if the legal risk is too high, if the users or advertisers are unhappy, and so on. But otherwise, it can benefit a company. So part of the business model too is how do they design these safety features? What are their policies? How do you enable flagging of content? Do you label AI or not? This is some of the discussion we had in class today. And the final part I want to note is the monetization structure. Hate can be monetized, and it can be whether it's for the influencer, or it might be links are provided from one platform to, say, a subscription site. And there are individuals making millions of dollars spreading false information. So what is the role of law here? Let's start with the basics. As we all know, freedom of expression is a fundamental right in a democratic society. It is a fulsome right. It includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas. Section 2B is given a broad and purposive interpretation, and limitations are reserved for just the clearest of cases. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly confirmed that hate speech laws are justified restrictions of that right. And it is worth pausing for a moment to look at the words of the Supreme Court. when they talk about why hate speech laws are meaningful. And this goes back to Keekstra. Expression can work to undermine our commitment to democracy. We're employed to propagate ideas that are anathema to democratic values. Hate propaganda works in just such a way, arguing as it does for society in which the democratic process is subverted and individuals are denied respect and dignity simply because of racial or religious characteristics. This brand of expressive activity is thus wholly inimical to the democratic aspirations of the free expression guarantee. In short, hate can work to chill freedom of expression by spoiling the environment and making it only welcome to a select few. So there are two types of laws to combat hate: laws applicable to individuals and laws applicable to online platforms. So let's first look at laws applicable to individuals. And I'm kind of, slowly galloping along here to show, why certain legal solutions are appropriate in this space. For now, what I want to identify is what we have as current law available. So currently, we have, for the most part, hate crimes, public incitement of hatred, willful promotion of hatred and anti-Semitism, counseling terrorism, advocating genocide, and so on. And I'm sure that later we will talk about Bill C-9, which are various proposals to amend the criminal code. Now, these would probably be the most direct and clearest laws that apply to address matters of hate when they rise to the level of being criminal behavior, but it's very rarely prosecuted. I think that the last stat I heard was that there were 4 last year across Canada. So given the amount of hate that we're seeing in the discourse about where that line is, it's not doing a lot of heavy lifting. Often there'll be adjacent crimes where hate will then be part of the sentencing of that particular crime. Or what we'll see is just other related adjacent behavior like mischief, targeting of often women through non-disclosure or non-consensual disclosure of intimate images, computer misuse. One can sue, but there isn't really a way, an easy avenue to sue for hate. The natural home would be defamation, but that only applies to false information that impacts an individual's reputation. The Supreme Court has held that group defamation, which would be where hate would land, is not well placed to be addressed through defamation law. And of course, we had human rights as an avenue until Section 13 was repealed under the Canadian Human Rights Act, briefly reintroduced under Bill C-63. And I expect it probably will not be reintroduced again. Perhaps we can talk about this after on our panel. So let's look then elsewhere. Because often what we're talking about is, what is an effective solution to combat hate? Well, the parties with power to be able to combat it in the online environment are platforms. Generally, this is an area of law known as intermediary liability. They are seen, at least historically, as kind of secondary actors where the primary bad behavior is individual A posting something hateful about individual B. Intermediary liability looks at whether the secondary actor, these intermediaries, maybe have certain responsibilities in law. The short story in Canada is that we do not have a comprehensive federal intermediary liability law here. Now, this is in contrast to the, at least that certain jurisdictions have addressed this. In Europe, since the year 2000, they have had what is an effective notice and takedown regime. And this is for all illegal content. Once a host knows that it is illegal, then they have an obligation to take it down, otherwise risk liability for the underlying wrong. The US went the other way, and in 1996 passed Section 230, the Communications Decency Act, and it grants an almost broad immunity to platforms for any of the content that they host. And that's why we see the American base of many of these companies having such an influence on the types of content that we see shared online. But there's a key thing about Section 230. It protected the companies for both the decision to take down content, but also leave it up. Therefore, that freedom of companies to kind of carve out stricter content moderation rules was also protected. The Canada, I say, has been relatively slow to address this particular area. The only province that has addressed it is Quebec, and it has essentially this notice and takedown regime for illicit content. But otherwise, Canada has developed kind of subject matter specific rules. It has special rules in copyright. It's kind of developed over time special rules in defamation. But with the recent trade agreement with CUSMA, it essentially imported the blanket immunity from the United States to Canada. I would say that the laws we currently have on the books that are most effective to hold companies accountable are indirect and have really nothing to do with hate specifically, and that would be private sector privacy laws in particular, and a little bit competition law. So what we have is an enormous gap in Canadian law. There are no federal laws that impose legal obligations on businesses concerning how they handle hate, despite being the major choke point to any effective regulation of this space. But I'd say there's a deeper problem at play. None of these laws, the laws applicable to individuals or the laws applicable to platforms, address systemic hate. So what do I mean by that? At its core, hate spreads the message that certain groups are less worthy than others. It is a systemic problem embedded into the institutions and structures of society, and it spreads through casual acts of racism and discrimination, or just a mental outlook of prejudice. And it tends to be masked as jokes or tucked into other messaging. Trad-wise content or fitness content has somehow been co-opted as some avenue into extremism. Fear not, if you watch a baking video, you're not that close to extremist material, but there is an ethos there. Technology bakes the hate into the system, making it invisible. And in a forthcoming article, I talk about it as the slow violence of online harms. So the idea of violence, when we think about it, brings to mind like the riot I talked about earlier, or a punch. But slow violence is a term that was coined to capture harms that occur gradually and are a product of systemic structures and inequality. So think of climate change, racism, poverty. So violence is not just when an event happens, such as a racially motivated attack, but the everyday ways that racism creates the conditions that chip away at our security and precipitate harm. This is more of a provocation than anything. It could never be a legal standard, but it's helpful to think through harm in this way. So laws applicable to individuals were never built and cannot be built to address systemic hatred. They are useful for two purposes. One is to hold individuals accountable for specific incidents of hate that have reached a certain legal threshold, and two, to address violence that is hate motivated. And the threshold for this is rightfully high. So the focus here should be, how do we make these laws more effective? Maybe we need to better resource and train law enforcement. Maybe we need strategic law reform and, good and bad about Bill C9. But systemic hatred is different. What we're looking at here is the need for inoculation. And it is much more difficult, but not impossible, at least for law to address. So let's flip the narrative for a moment. What is a healthy information ecosystem? I can't go through all of this right now. It is complicated and there's a lot there. And this is just one image of what a healthy information ecosystem looks like. But we need to start looking at what those building blocks are. It ranges from looking at it from an infrastructure level to what does a healthy media environment look like, down to just individual and community responsibilities. Law has an important role to play here in creating incentives, but when I look at this, what it tells me is that we need to lean into the complexity and identify the various moves that are needed that individually can contribute to make the system better. Often efforts are criticized as not doing enough or not wholly solving the problem, but looking at this diagram, no one effort will ever solve these problems. So where would I start? for those that know my work, not surprisingly, I would start with online harms legislation. But I will identify the limits of this kind of law in our discussion. So earlier I spoke about these kind of first generation intermediary liability laws that were really focused on a content level about removing content or protecting companies for not removing content. So the model to look at here would be Europe, and they have passed the Digital Services Act. And it moves beyond looking at content to lifting the lid about the systemic structures about how companies operate. It's about the business model. Now, it's a complicated piece of legislation, but in essence, the DSA, what we're concerned about here, creates obligations on very large online platforms and search providers to put in place measures to mitigate the risks, the systemic risks of harm stemming from the design or function of their services. So we're talking about consumer protection legislation. So putting in place systems to address when it comes to their recommender systems, their content moderation systems, terms and conditions, their data practices, advertising practices, and so on. This is a different way to approach the regulation of platforms. And it's more about the direct role that platforms play in fueling different illegal activity. And today we're talking about hate. So the shift is important because it requires companies to put in place essentially safety measures to address what the impact is of their business model and business practices on certain illegal activity, whether it is on civic discourse or gender-based violence or on the spread of hatred. This is as close to the law that I can think of that can at least get some ways towards looking at systemic hate. Now, let's take a look at the duty to act responsibly that was set out in the now dead Bill C-63. And it's worth taking a look at this bill briefly, even though it is it died on the order paper, because hopefully some version 2.0 is going to be reintroduced by the government, and we should talk about what that should look like, what the next version of it is. The basic structure was modeled somewhat on the Digital Services Act, in that it set out that platforms have a duty to act responsibly to mitigate the risks of exposure to 7 categories of content. Concerning hate, it was content that foments hatred, incites violence, incites violent extremism, or terrorism. So at a basic level, it required that social media put in place practices, a digital safety plan, that they carried it out, they were transparent about these practices, and this would be overseen by a regulator. The bill also, rightly in my view, had a special focus, a special duty to children. I think important here is to understand that the bill would only have required content removal for non-consensual sharing of intimate images and child sexual abuse material. So what would this mean for hateful content? It perhaps might disappoint some in the room. There would be no obligation to take down even illegal hate speech. That said, I would say in practice, reducing the risk of exposure to that type of content would mean, practically speaking, they would be taking down some of this content. I think one of the risks was that the way the bill was drafted, companies might put in place sloppy solutions that over-remove lawful expression, and there was nothing that kind of safeguarded against that. The main requirement would have been that companies would have to explain that digital safety plan, and a regulator could investigate them for failing to comply. And there were other specific provisions in the bill that look at kind of the technical features that foment hatred, having to flag inauthentic accounts, having resource people on the ground for a company, having user empowerment tools like the ability to block content, something very simple that, of course, X removed for a while. So could a user complain about hate speech to this regulator? No. They could speak to an ombudsperson, but for hate speech, the regulator essentially had a role that was a further step removed, that was looking at, is the company oriented in the direction of digital safety? And we will look at their compliance across a wide variety of behavior and practices. So I'm going to leave you with two things because I'm afraid that I may have been a little over exuberant and taken more time than I should have. So let's think about Bill C-63 version 2.0, what's coming ahead. There have been some push in at least some circles I've been in to just make this bill about child safety. And I do understand that inclination, but I do think it would be the wrong move given what we have talked about today about many of these online challenges. I think that ship sailed a long time ago to just focus on kids. A live question is the categories of harm to include. Content that foments hatred, that drew from Supreme Court jurisprudence. Violent extremism, that's actually more of a term of art. It's used in the trust and safety community. I've heard law enforcement use it, but it's not a legal term. So we should be very clear on what we're talking about and what's scoped in. And we should also consider the new landscape of harm. We should avoid legislating for the internet of yesterday. So it's crucial that we look closer at scoping in particular chatbots and AI facilitating harms. And I think we should reconsider whether to include and how to include gaming, virtual reality, and some of the risks and benefits of having obligations on private messaging providers. I say that with some hesitation about private messaging because you don't want to undermine privacy and cybersecurity in the process. So let me leave you with the other side of law, sort of. Eventually, the road runs out for law. It can only do so much and should only be able to do so much. So for the most part, we rely on good faith efforts of people to exercise the right to freedom of expression carefully. And that's why simply talking about expression as freedom without corresponding duties and responsibilities is so misleading. It ends up losing its moral compass. In the case of online platforms, the law, for the most part, can only require companies to address illegal content. Now, there is some nuance in this idea that is beyond the scope of this talk, but the online world would be a cesspool if companies just stuck to the law. We actually rely on them to govern and govern beyond the law. And this does create a unique challenge. Companies are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to job owning, where governments are basically going to them behind the scenes and trying to pressure them to deal with content a certain way. And companies, no matter what they do, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't, no matter what they create. And yes, this is a world where they are now private arbiters of expression. What about individuals? Our focus should be changing on the narrative of what it means to have a right to freedom of expression. Civility is not just about being nice. It is a meaningful component of expressing oneself. Justice Abella, in her former life, once wrote, "For democracy to work, we must never forget how the world looks to those who are vulnerable." Certainly, civility is a contested space, and cast too widely, it will silence the voices of difference and dissent. But freedom of expression should never be confused with comfortable speech, but it should be exercised with grace and care. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would invite Michael and Angeline to join us on the stage for the conversation. But maybe just before we start, can I remind you? So feel free to just scan the QR code and ask your question. And some of you already did that page. While we're waiting for Michael and John is telling Amy, there is a question of clarification for you, because you did a lot about freedom of expression, but often in the media, people often refer to like freedom of speech. And so, could you maybe explain the difference, if there was any? And how we know that confusion may lead to some issue.
Yeah, and I actually keep wanting to fall back on freedom of speech because it just flows more easily off the tongue, but Canada has always been very focused on freedom of expression. Freedom of speech is very much a US concept and is looking very specifically at words, and they've had to kind of carve in other types of expressive acts. Well, Canada very clearly set out that it's freedom of expression. So any type of expression, whether it is signs, whether it maybe was, say, an act of blocking a car, something that is done to convey meaning, falls into the category of freedom of expression.
So thank you so much, Michael and Jenny, for joining us. And maybe to kick off the conversation, I would like to maybe start with like follow-ups on some of the points that Ellie mentioned in the talk. And she mentioned like two different bills and proposal. And one of the first one was so the new bill C9, that is for those who don't know in the room, the new combating hate act proposal by the federal government. And so you mentioned maybe that criminal law is often is already used, doing a lot of like heavy lifting. We know there is a lot of conversation about deepfake not being covered by the current provisions. So what we could do, it might be also like a focus on content and not on like systemic issues. But yeah, maybe if we can start by you, Michael, because I know you have been like very vocal also in those conversation on Bill C9 job, like your perspective on this proposal.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks, Florian, and thanks for your talk, Emily, and thank you for everyone who's here. I guess I'll start by saying that I'm mindful of what Emily just emphasized, that there is no single fix, and we should be cautious about criticizing solutions that don't necessarily solve all of these problems. This is deeply complex, and I say that in part because I look at part of what C9 is attempting to do, as Florian mentioned, is combating hate act, and I think it's primarily a federal government response to concerns about what we've seen on campuses, especially on streets. So to extend online, but offline as well, in terms of hate and the challenge of how you reconcile some of the expression issues that Emily just highlighted. And it's very much on my mind. I hope you don't mind if I digress for just a sec. So I wrote a piece last night. See if anybody will pick it up. And in it, I opened by talking about my late grandfather, who was a Holocaust survivor who lived in the Bathurst and Shepherd area in Toronto. It's a probably Jewish area. Took daily walked for 2-3 hours. That would last quite a while, despite all the time in the camps. And I thought of him this weekend as I saw masked protesters walk in residential neighborhoods exactly on the same streets where he used to walk. And the target there is not targeting governments or institutions, it's targeting people. It's the assumption that this is a Jewish community area, and so we're going to target that area. And so the challenge then becomes, how do you address that? It's pretty clear that law enforcement didn't, at least in Toronto this past weekend, arguing that these are expression rights, and you've got the right to be able to do that. Now, what C9 seeks to do, borrowed from older legislation that was designed to safeguard people's ability to go into abortion clinics, which were often also the target at times of protests and the like, was to say that where there are vulnerable institutions, be it schools or hospitals or places of worship, that doing so with an intent to intimidate takes you outside of the kind of expression that we like to protect. I think the government gets it right in that regard. Although, again, just to highlight how just challenging this issue is, I wonder how we protect people, not just places. And I wonder a little bit what my grandfather would have thought about what was taking place on the various streets that he used to walk.
Thank you, Jamie.
Well, Before I came, I dusted off my 2002 master's thesis on internet hate propagation. The world looks a little different, but actually I think a lot of the fundamentals are quite similar. And I guess the thing I'm thinking about C9 is that when I look around what's happening in the world, I'm a little less sanguine about the responsible, equitable exercise of authority by the state than I used to be. And so I get concerned about criminal prohibitions. I think we have criminal prohibitions that we actually don't enforce, and I think that we should. And I worry that when I look at, for example, the way that trans people are being dehumanized in our country and around the world, how that can be turned into someone with authority as a threat. And I worry about the use of criminal sanction for those reasons. I really think there's no quick fix here. I thought that in 2002. I think it now. I thought it in 1993 when I was on the first Canadian Human Rights Tribunal hearing of internet hate speech about the Zundel site. So I thought it now. I think it now. There are easy fixes, and if we don't get to the systemic issues, and if we don't get to the way that the structural and systemic issues are being perpetrated and perpetuated by the corporate model that monetizes this stuff, I think we're, as my mother would say, spinning into the wind. So I'm not saying what about any of this, but I'm very concerned, and I know quick action and criminalization is seen as being tough, and I understand that, and I understand that governments want to be seen to be doing something, and it's important that they do. But we like too often it stops there, and we just simply can't afford to stop there. There's systemic structural work that's got to be done, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And it's going to require having some very tough conversations with platforms about what they're going to be allowed to make money from.
Maybe share also your perspective, Amy, and like dig in on one of the questions we asked, because I know like in the that like Bill 63, there was like some section that were like including criminal provisions that were like heavily debated, and so someone was also asking if maybe the use of the criminal code is not the way it should maybe go after and have a real like authority over like the individuals, not just like the platforms. We always this issue between like content and system issues.
Yes, there's a few ways to answer this. I would say, as a starting point, Bill C9 is essentially reintroducing a revamped version of what had initially been that part of Bill C63. And to their credit, I would say they have taken some of the feedback that was negative about that and reformulated Bill C9, but then have also added other things. We do need criminal law, in my view, to address the worst of the hate crimes. I think that the challenge is that it's only ever positioned properly to deal with the most extreme forms of hate. And so when I look at the criminal law, my lens tends to be relatively practical in the sense of, one of the proposals is the removal of the need for attorney general access. And I will say, I don't know where I land on that, because it begs the question, why was consent not being given to prosecution? Is that because it was providing necessary oversight, or was there just more of a nervousness about prosecuting crimes that should have been prosecuted. I think that there is a major resourcing challenge that law enforcement is facing to be able to address all of this. It's overwhelming. But where I do think that an important change here is, and I kind of, my views evolved on this one, so I'm curious what you both think, is I do think there should be a standalone hate crime. And I will say I was convinced after several conversations with Mohammed Hashim from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And some of this is just the fact that when it is a standalone crime, it's essentially in the system, and that hate is at the forefront of understanding what the crime is that is committed. It is tracked that way. It carries all the way through to prosecution. It can get lost in the mix, the hate, if it's left to sentencing, and it's also the thing that's tacked on at the end. Is it something that's going to be prosecuted a lot? No, but I think it has its place, and I think that it's an important addition. And we can look at some more. I mean, when we talk about the particular provisions that are regulating access to spaces for protests, part of me thought, do we need it? We already have existing laws. Is this a reaction to exactly the kind of scenario you're talking about? Well, actually, that Bill 9 wouldn't even address that. It wouldn't address it at all. And so we have this overwhelming challenge ahead of us. I think that it was scoped a bit broadly, like if they want to create it in the sense similarly to kind of blocking areas around abortion clinics for certain things like places of worship, community centers. They should. I think it was scoped so broadly it would end up capturing a lot of sort of mixed use sites. But that's just ends up getting into the weeds of drafting. What Jane said about the challenges of the platforms. I mean, that's where we get at a structure now about our discourse. That's where hate is spreading. That is what's fueling this fire. And it's alarming to me how little there is in terms of law to hold companies accountable.
Yeah, but also, and to reflect on what you just said, and one of the question on like maybe also those kind of proposal, yeah, opportunity for like to rethink and reinforce the role of like law enforcement, and maybe making sure that they take those kind of harms and crimes seriously. You mentioned something like super important and that we discussed a lot as part of the CCA expert group on digital public safety is the resources within law enforcement. Even if we have like criminal provision, it will not solve anything. It might actually solve like nothing if we don't have like the people who are like trained with the proper like digital literacy who can understand the platform, the ecosystem, but also like the victims, and they can like talk to each other. And that's something when we were like as part of the CCA report that was like heavily highlighted is the need to train the workforce within law enforcement, but also to have cooperation within the agencies to make sure they can like tackle those kind of like issues that are often not just like in one jurisdiction. Although I really like that you mentioned SCGTI, so the Quebec statute that has that framework when we think of so many of the online platforms actually being headquarters in Montreal, like Pornhub. We think that maybe Quebec law could be used a bit more by the victims and people online. Maybe I would like to move to another topic that I also touch on maybe is the human rights recourses in section 13. You touch a bit about this, and I'm sure Jane will like to react on this because I know you gave a lot of thought to this.
Yeah, so full disclosure, of course, the internet human rights case that I was on in 1993 or whenever that was, it was a Section 13 case. It was the first Section 13 case, And it was not a perfect process. Human rights tribunals then and now are chronically underfunded and under-resourced. But for me, to cast hate against identifiable communities as a human rights issue is central to all of this, right? Because it's this form of marginalization disparately affects marginalized communities, identifiable on a variety of categories. In the case of the Zundel site, it was anti-Semitism. And many of these sites actually they proliferate in terms of the kinds of hate that they're spreading. So for me to categorize this for what the essence of it is, which is a human rights violation, it is an attempt to dehumanize people. And we know, Mr. Romanescu, you talked about, we know the history. I mean, Alexander Thesis wrote a book many years ago documenting the way that dehumanization paves the way to violence. And so we know this to be a case that we know we have a good authority and we have a good precedent for understanding this as a human rights issue. So if you have specialized tribunals that are experts in thinking about human rights issues, they're experts in thinking about the equality and power imbalances that are at play, even amongst marginalized communities. To me, that's a rich possibility. Now, people will say, "Well, people will abuse it." Yes, absolutely. If we took the Attorney General approval of the criminal prosecution, there will be proliferation of private prosecution. I do understand that, but if you have a properly resourced tribunal and you have robust measures for preliminary assessment and prompt dismissal if it doesn't pass the threshold, to me, that's an actual opportunity to take these on as the human rights issues that they are. And so I was very upset, and I testified at Senate at the time that Section 13 was repealed. And what I said then, I everybody loves, especially people with gray hair, love to say that they were proven right. But that it was the exact wrong moment. This was the exact wrong moment. Things were just about to explode in what Emily has now beautifully laid out for us. Things were just about to explode, and we took away the only human rights remedy that we had for that. And having worked on that for a while, we were the envy of many countries in the world for the fact that we have that as a mechanism for addressing hate. And so I'm a firm believer, but obviously only if we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to resource that tribunal, and we're going to resource the commission, and we're going to have robust preliminary mechanisms for dismissing cases that don't warrant being in front of the human rights tribunal.
Well, we had this, for those who don't know, we had the same debate, in the exact same spot, back when Bill C-63. And I guess I'll fit with the same position. At a minimum, I had concerns with the inclusion of this provision in Bill C-63 in the online harms bill. And one of the reasons that was articulated at that time, right, and I think it was right, was that at the end of the day, it sunk the bill. And so if your goal was fundamentally to try to address some of these issues, to me, I'd rather take the largest elements in this legislation, which had to do with the duty to act responsibly for the large platform, which at the end of the day did not go forward in large measure because of the attempt to try to include both the human rights component and the criminal code components, which ultimately led to some pretty significant opposition. Government just didn't have some to fight it, and they realized so late in the day that by the time they said, okay, we're open to a two-track system with different issues, it was too late, and we had protested and the bill was. So I was, from a pure political perspective, I thought it was a mistake. But I'm also still left to, I'm still left concerned by a couple of things. One, what is this concern about the prospect of weaponization? As someone who has been pretty out there on some of these kinds of issues, I can tell you that the sort of stuff that I get in my feeds and my personal emails is awful at times. And the possibility that some may well see this kind of process as an opportunity to essentially engage in inversion, where rather than trying to protect people who are being victimized, it actually is used to victimize the very people that are taking action. And we're seeing, frankly, I think a lot of that taking place in a range of workplaces right now, where people raise concerns and then are themselves subject to complaints and threats. And I fear that that might well happen within the human rights context. I am also, just quickly, left to wonder whether or, well, I believe that at the end of the day, we've got both an offline problem and an online problem. And I do think that I do think we make a mistake if we focus exclusively on the platforms and say this is an internet issue. It is not just an internet issue. But I think that there are better solutions, whether we are talking about an offline issue or an online issue. If it's an offline issue, then the Human Rights Act is not where the centrality of these provisions were. It was designed to try to incorporate the online component. If it is the online component that we're looking to deal with, well, then let's deal with the platforms, which is where things like duty to act responsibly sought to focus. It's nice to tell someone, yes, there is some potential avenue where you might get a remedy. But my guess is for many people who are the targets of these things, they are more concerned with seeing it stop than they are in sort of getting some sort of remedy through the system. And so that's why I would rather the resources and the political energy be focused on solutions that I think offer up a better likelihood of trying, not solving the issue, but trying to do.
So the thing about it is, for me, it's not an either or. It's not you regulate the platforms or you have the human rights remedy. And furthermore, one of the problems with the human rights remedy in my mind was that it was not a remedy that could be used against the platforms, which made no sense, who are engaged in human rights violations themselves by their very design. And so in many instances, so it's not either or to me. And what we do know is that online systems, moderation systems, are definitely being weaponized. And they're being weaponized in ways that we don't understand. People scramble to understand, are certain communities being over censored? And we don't know. That's private regulation or public policy. So the idea that systems will be weaponized, that's always going to be true no matter what you do. So I don't necessarily find that particularly compelling. And did the presence of a human rights remedy sink the bill? You and I could maybe talk about that at another time. But at the end of the day, my answer to that, if it did, it was because people were refusing to treat this as refusing to treat it as a human rights issue. And finally, in all the work that we've done with young people, the idea that you talk about online and offline as different things is just not the world that certainly young people live in, and I wouldn't imagine not the world that you live in, given how much you engage in the online environment. But these things are seamlessly integrated in young people's lives. So the idea that we have one or another, I think really doesn't really line up with everything that is certainly that young people are telling us about what their lived experiences are like.
Again, that's what we say, on that last point of online versus offline, Emily chose a picture offline. People in the UK to start with, and you could have chosen from a myriad of similar kinds of offline instances. The notion that you didn't choose a computer screen. Yes, of course, there is integration, there is planning, there is fomenting this. No one is suggesting otherwise. But as someone who has experienced this both online and offline, I can tell you there is a qualitative difference when you are looking directly at someone with a mask on, with what looks to be threatening violence, from the nonsense that I get in my notifications.
Yeah. At the same time, I agree with you, but Sandra, I would say, like, a lot of those offline, behaviors and organization are like organized online, and often like it's also fitted through like social media and with the smartphone. So I would say like in between as my role model, in between Ron James position, but because I knew we should have had like a 3-hour time slot for this like shameless conversation, but we're kind of running out of time. But still, because there's a lot of questions coming from the audience about like, so what's next? How can we make the big platform, the algorithmic platform, like accountable? So Bill 63, the order. What's next, June? Yeah, should we add something new? What should it be? You kind of started to tease out this in your talk, and I have a 2-hour keynote on this, and you heard me a lot, but like, what should be the next bill? So I will just try to stay in my role as a moderator. But what do you see, like ads, chatbots, product messaging, like more content or systems?
So let me see. It's an extraordinary restraint that I'm not jumping in on our last discussion because I know that we are closing things down. But I will say that Bill C-63, that part 1 about platform regulation, was very heavily consulted. Expert advisors, youth assemblies, citizens assemblies across the country. So, and the response from all these different groups was relatively the same, and that is what was the product in the bill. So I would say the basic structure of the bill is sound, and we need that essentially yesterday. Where the points of debate would be who's targeted by the bill, what kind of platforms, and what the scope of the bill is. And I think that is a live point for discussion. I think that if they stick with the same narrow definition as social media providers targeted by it, it will be regulating for problems that we have moved beyond. I think it's absolutely critical that at very minimum, chatbots are added to this bill, and I think they need to seriously rethink the scope of the types of platforms that they're including. Gaming is one of the key places where hate is being fomented. I mean, think of what the news we've seen recently about Roblox. It seems incredibly odd that we would be passing a bill that is promoted often about child safety, and yet you're not going to scope in Roblox. And it's also been used by companies to say, oh, we're not social media platforms. Companies like Snapchat would say, no, we're just very much private messaging now. None of this applies to us. So it's a very easy way to start wiggling out of responsibilities.
Jane, Michael, you want to?
The only thing that the one thing I really agree with your comments about the DSA and the importance of thinking systemically from a systems approach. Because the other word I haven't said yet, and I always say, is equality. Because that's something that's fundamental at the fundamental heart, and that's a systemic issue. And when we deal with online harms, we have to be thinking in terms of equality. And when we're directing service providers or whoever our regulated entities are about how they need to be carrying out these responsibilities, there's got to be some direction with respect to substantive equality And that the references in the DSA to non-discrimination, I think and privacy are really important. In addition to freedom of expression, because these are all rights. We don't have hierarchy of rights in Canada. It's the Supreme Court of Canada has told us multiple times. And so the direction of attention of the business community to the equal importance of all of those rights and obligations, and looking at things systemically, I think is a huge insight from the DSA that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, so I align myself with what we just heard, and I do think that the online harms bill, with respect to how it dealt with the platforms, are better. Let me just close with sort of illustration of just how the challenge we're up against. So I'm fairly active on social media. Yesterday, put out 2 tweets, effectively. One was to promote the latest episode of my podcast. It's a good episode with Jan Gerlach, who's director of public policy for Wikimedia. It also happened to be the 250th episode, so it got a bit of attention. But so I did that post. I also did a post coming out of a new podcast series focusing on anti-Semitism in Canada from Canada Land, Jesse Brown. And that tweet cited a stat that he raised on that first episode, in which he noted, right, that there have been more attacks on synagogues in Canada than any other country in the world. In fact, was what he said. Well, the tweet, or the X, whatever you call it nowadays, on the podcast generated, honestly, about a handful of engagements and a few thousand views. The one on the synagogue attacks generated hundreds of likes and retweets, tens of thousands of views and impressions, and the commentary about false flags, and you all brought it on yourself, and all of these kinds of things is just a steady stream through my notifications. That's the algorithm at work. One of those tweets drives engagement, one of them does not. And I'm not sure that there's legislation that fixes that, but at a minimum, we need greater transparency about how these choices are made so that people understand what is actually happening at work after they click send or apply or whatever it is that they have.
And can I jump in with one thing to say? That's actually one of the most important things in the Digital Services Act, was the idea that there was researcher access to the platforms to be able to lift the lid and do that kind of research. And yes, they are absolutely going through growing pains right now, trying to articulate precisely the terms of that access and what that looks like. But that's the only way then to start looking a lot closer at that ecosystem so that we can understand it better. And then the regulators can create better codes of practice and oversight.
That was a perfect last word from you. Thank you so much, Emilia. I'm sorry we haven't been able to address all of the questions, but I think we've been able to address, at least answer most of them. It was a very rich conversation. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, Amy. And I'm sure we will have an opportunity to redo this next time the bill is introduced. And I think maybe something I take out of this conversation is the urgency for the government to retable a bill. And when you have the four of us in agreement that's part one of the C63 was actually maybe a good idea. I think you have something good. So let's hope they will introduce this with a broader scope of chatbots and gaming system. And often we hear, to answer myself one of those questions, the government is pro-business, etc. Well, if we want to be pro-Canadian business, it might be time to actually regulate those big platforms. So American, this is something Emilia and I were last week with innovators from 2 weeks ago from BC, but actually calling for more regulation to level the playing field with the American company to kind of protect what is Canadians and the Canadian vision of the online space. So I think it's a call for action for the government. And so thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was recorded. We will have the video online, and we hope to continue the conversation with more events with you in the coming months. Thank you so much.